You know, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is how often build systems that technically make perfect sense, but still don't quite land in the real world. Not because they're broken and not because the technology isn't capable, but because somewhere along the way, what made sense to the business stopped making sense to the people using it on a day-to-day basis. And if you're in a position where you're responsible for the Salesforce platform or any other system really, you probably have felt this tension before, even if you weren't able to put a label on it. Because on one side, you got the business asking for structure, consistency, visibility, reliable reporting, all completely valid and, in fact, all absolutely essential. But on the other side, you've got the reality how work actually happens. Busy days, interrupted workflows, people switching between tasks consistently, decisions being made quickly, sometimes with incomplete information. And those two worlds, the structured version of work and the real version of work, don't always align as neatly as we like to believe. What I've noticed over the years is that most systems naturally lean towards one of those worlds. They're designed around processes, around how things should happen, when everything is followed step by step. Really, this perfect scenario situation. And that's not inherently wrong. Processes what allow businesses to scale. They create consistency, they give leadership confidence in the data they are looking at. But processes are usually designed in calm environments. They're designed in workshops, in structured conversations, in diagrams where everything flows logically from one step to the next. But people don't operate that in the real work environment. They operate in the middle of everything else going on. They're reacting, adjusting, prioritizing. Sometimes they're doing things properly and thoroughly, and sometimes they're just trying to keep things moving quickly. And when a system is built entirely around the ideal version of a process, it quite assumes that people behave in a way that doesn't really exist in a day-to-day work environment. And that is where restrictions start to show. Not in a big obvious way, but just in these small little things. A pause before entering data, a quick decision to skip something, feeling that something is taking longer than it should. And all those small signals, they all matter, because over time, they're going to shape the behavior of your users. Now, when we talk about designing for users and for humans, I think it's important to clarify what that actually means. Because it's easy to interpret it as making things simpler or more flexible or less controlled. But that's not really the point. Designing for humans is about starting from reality instead of theory. It's about understanding when someone is dealing with in that moment when they open the system. What else is competing for their attention? How much time do you realistically have? What are they trying to achieve quickly, not perfectly? I mean, take that perspective, something is starting to shift. You should stop asking, what information do we need here? And you should start asking, what is reasonable to expect from someone at this point in their day? And that might sound like a small change, but it has a huge impact on how systems are designed. Take something simple as login activity. We all do it within Salesforce. From a process point of view, it makes complete sense to capture as much detail as possible. You want the full context, consistent categorization, clear outcomes. But in reality, the person doing that might only have a couple of minutes or even less. They're moving between meetings or picking something up quickly before heading over to the next task, or maybe even, as usual, between calls. So in that moment, they're going to make a trade-off. Do I invest time here, or do I keep things moving? And if a system doesn't align with reality, you don't get better data. You get behavior that works around the system. And now this is where I think something really important gets missed in most Salesforce projects. The people designing the system and the people using the system are often quite apart. You have business stakeholders thinking about outcomes, and you got technical teams thinking about structure and feasibility. But there's often a missing perspective in the middle. Someone who's constantly thinking about how will this actually play out in someone's day. And that's where a good or great trainer comes into play. Not at the end of the process, but early on, at the beginning stages. Because a good trainer naturally sits between these two worlds. A trainer understands what the business is trying to achieve, but he also understands how people behave, how they learn, and how they actually interact with the system under pressure on a day-to-day basis. And that combination is incredibly valuable during your design, because trainers tend to ask different questions. We will look at the process and say, okay, but what happens when someone is interrupted halfway through this? Or what does it look like for someone who's new or not confident with the system yet? Or is this realistic when someone already has 5 other things going on at the same time? And these aren't questions that always come up in standard design conversations, but they're questions that determine whether something will actually work. I've seen many situations where a system is technically well designed, but doesn't quite fit in the real workflow. And often it's because those real life scenarios were never fully explored. A good trainer brings those scenarios to the surface early. We challenge assumptions. We help shape the system in a way that reflects actual behavior, not ideal behavior. And when that's going to happen, you don't have to rely on training later to fix things, because the system already makes more sense from the beginning. Now, that doesn't mean that training becomes less important. In fact, it becomes even more powerful. Because now training isn't about explaining something that feels disconnected. It's about reinforcing something that already feels intuitive. It becomes a way of helping people understand how to use the system effectively within the context of their role. Not just what buttons to click, but how it fits into what they are trying to achieve. And that's a very different experience. It's also where training becomes a feedback loop. Because when you're training delivering properly, you see how people react in real time. You see where they hesitate, where they question things, when something doesn't quite land. And those moments are really, really valuable in any project. Because they tell you whether the system is aligned with reality or whether there's still a gap to be bridged. And it only works if someone is listening. If training is treated as a tick box exercise at the end, you miss all of this valuable information. But if it's treated as part of your overall design and enablement strategy, you start to continuously improve how the system and the people around it work together. And that's what it really comes down to in the end. It's not about designing for processes or designing for humans. You need both. A business without processes becomes inconsistent. A system without structure becomes unreliable. But a process that ignores human behavior will always struggle. And a system that doesn't fit into people's day will always feel like extra work. So the overall goal is alignment, where the system supports how people naturally operate, and the process supports what the business needs to achieve. And in that space, everything will become much easier for everybody involved. Adoption will improve without being forced. The data quality will improve without people having to constantly change for it. And your users will feel far more confident in using the system. Not because you have told them to, but because it actually works for them. So if you're thinking about your own environment or planning changes, or maybe a completely new implementation, it might be worth asking the question slightly different. Not just, is the process correctly reflected in the system? But ask, does it make sense for someone on a normal, busy day? And just as importantly, do we have the right people involved to answer that question properly? Because that's often where the difference is made. Not in the technology and not in process diagrams, but in how well these things reflect in a real life scenario. So when you get that right, you don't have to push adoption and you don't need to enforce behavior because the system will just fit. And that's usually where you know you've designed something that actually works.